The helicopter's rotor blades screamed against the 185-mile-per-hour winds as Captain Elena Vasquez fought to keep the battered UH-60 Black Hawk level. Through the cracked windscreen, she could see the oil rig platform tilting at an impossible angle, its support legs buckling under the Category 5 hurricane's relentless assault. 47 souls were trapped on that metal island, and she was flying the only bird the Navy deemed expendable enough for the suicide mission. "Nomad 7, this is Tower Control," crackled the voice in her headset, barely audible over the storm's fury. "We're reading sustained winds at 185 knots with gusts over 200. The F-35s turned back 20 minutes ago. You need to abort immediately." Elena's jaw tightened as she adjusted the collective, feeling the helicopter's frame shudder like an old building in an earthquake. The Black Hawk beneath her wasn't just any aircraft. It was hull number 8724613, affectionately known around the base as the Widowmaker. 3 pilots had already declared it unflyable after a training accident 6 months ago left it with a cracked main rotor hub, hydraulic issues that made the controls feel like wrestling a bull, and an engine that ran hot enough to fry eggs on the cowling. "Negative, Tower Control," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "I've got visual on survivors. Beginning approach." The radio exploded with static and overlapping voices, her commanding officer ordering her to return to base, the Coast Guard coordinator screaming about liability, and somewhere in the mix, a voice she recognized as Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Rivera, her old flight instructor. "Elena, don't do this. That bird won't hold together in these winds. We've already lost 2 good pilots this year." She clicked off the radio and focused on the impossible task ahead. The Widowmaker groaned and bucked beneath her like a wild horse, its damaged systems fighting her every input. Through the storm, she could see the oil rig's emergency beacon flashing desperately, a tiny orange pulse in an ocean gone mad. Elena Vasquez had been flying helicopters for 12 years, ever since she'd enlisted at 18 to escape the suffocating poverty of East LA. She'd earned her wings the hard way, proving herself again and again in a world that seemed determined to remind her she didn't belong. The daughter of a janitor and a seamstress, she'd clawed her way from maintenance crew to pilot training, enduring everything from subtle sabotage to outright hostility from colleagues who questioned whether a 5'4" Latina had any business in a cockpit. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the St. Christopher medal her grandmother had pressed into her palm the day she left for basic training, the same medal that now hung from the helicopter's instrument panel, spinning wildly in the turbulence. What mattered was the photo tucked into her flight helmet, her younger brother Miguel in his graduation cap, the first person in their family to finish college, made possible by the money she'd sent home every month. The oil rig loomed larger. Through the windscreen, its platform listing at 30 degrees and taking on water with each massive wave. Elena could see people clustered near the helicopter landing pad, their bright orange survival suits stark against the dark metal of the RIG. They were waving frantically, and she could almost feel their desperation radiating across the churning water. "Chief," Petty Officer Sarah Mitchell's voice came through the intercom from the cabin behind her. "Ma'am, I've got the rescue hoist ready. But the platform's moving like a carnival ride. And look at that wind indicator, we're getting hammered from 3 directions." Elena glanced at her crew chief, a 20-year veteran whose steady hands had pulled more than 300 people from disaster zones. Sarah's face was grim but determined, her short gray hair plastered against her skull by the humidity that had somehow penetrated even their sealed cabin. Beside her, Hospital Corpsman Second Class David Chin was checking and rechecking his medical supplies, his usually steady hands betraying the slightest tremor as he secured the rescue basket. "Sarah, I need you to tell me the moment this bird starts coming apart," Elena said, beginning her approach. "David, be ready for hypothermia cases." Some of those people have been in the water. The Widowmaker shuddered as a massive gust caught it from the side, the damaged rotor hub sending vibrations through the entire airframe that felt like being inside a paint mixer. Elena compensated with stick and pedals, drawing on every hour of flight time, every emergency she'd survived, every moment of training that had prepared her for this impossibility. Below them, the Gulf of Mexico had transformed into something from another planet. Waves the size of apartment buildings rolled and crashed with a violence that made Elena's stomach lurch. The hurricane had been building for days, feeding off the warm waters as it spiraled toward the Texas coast. Hurricane Omega, the meteorologists had run out of regular names, was being called the storm of the century. Nomad 7, this is Rescue Coordination Center. A new voice broke through the radio static. We're tracking multiple F-35 Lightning II aircraft that attempted this rescue 30 minutes ago. They couldn't maintain stability in these conditions and were forced to return to base. Please reconsider your approach. Elena's grip tightened on the controls. The F-35s, the most advanced fighter jets in the world, capable of speeds over Mach 1.6, equipped with every technological marvel the military could pack into their airframes. They'd turned back. But here she was, in a broken helicopter held together by determination and spite, preparing to do what a $250 million fighter jet COULDN, single quotes D. The irony wasn't lost on her. For 3 years she'd been requesting assignment to one of the Navy's newer rescue helicopters, the MH-6OR, Seahawks with their advanced avionics and pristine maintenance records. Instead, she'd been repeatedly assigned to the Widowmaker, told it was appropriate for her experience level, and that she needed to prove herself before earning the privilege of flying better equipment. She'd proven herself a dozen times over. Elena had completed more successful rescues in the past 2 years than any other pilot in her squadron. She'd pulled fishing crews from sinking boats in 12-foot seas, evacuated oil workers from platform fires, and once, memorably, airlifted a pregnant woman from a remote island during a tropical storm that grounded every other aircraft on the base. But the Widowmaker had been her constant companion, its quirks and failures as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. She knew exactly how much pressure to apply to the collective when the hydraulics stuttered. She'd memorized the sound the engine made just before it was about to overheat. She could feel through the stick the precise moment when the damaged rotor hub was about to set up a resonance that could tear the aircraft apart. "Ma'am," Sarah's voice was tight with concern, "we're getting some unusual vibrations in the tail." "Rotor, the frequency's changing with the wind direction." Elena nodded grimly. The tail rotor, the helicopter's most vulnerable component in high winds, was taking a beating. If it failed, they'd spin out of control like a leaf in a tornado. But as she looked down at the oil rig, she could see that waiting wasn't an option. The platform was taking on more water with each wave, and the people clustered on the landing pad were running out of time. She keyed her microphone for what she knew might be her last transmission. "Tower control, Nomad 7. I have 47. Souls in immediate danger and a bird that's still flying. We're going in." The response was immediate and furious, a cacophony of orders to abort, warnings about court-martial, and threats of disciplinary action. Elena reached over and switched off the radio entirely. The sudden silence was almost peaceful, broken only by the howl of wind and the labored beating of rotor blades. "Sarah, David," she said over the intercom, "I need to know you're both committed to this. If either of you wants out, speak now. We can still turn back." Sarah Mitchell looked up from her equipment check, her weathered face set with determination. She'd been flying rescues since before Elena was old enough to drive, pulling sailors from burning ships during the Gulf War and hurricane victims from rooftops during Katrina. "Ma'am, I've flown with a lot of pilots over the years. Some were better than others, but you're the first one I've seen who can make this heap of junk dance." If you think we can pull this off, I'm with you. David Chun nodded emphatically, his young face flushed with adrenaline and determination. At 26, he was the newest member of their crew, but he'd already proven himself during a series of offshore medical evacuations the previous month. I've got enough medical supplies for 50 casualties, and more importantly, I've got faith in this crew. Let's bring them home. Elena felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the overheated engine. This was why she flew, not for the medals or recognition, but for moments like these when ordinary people chose to do extraordinary things. The oil rig was close enough now that she could make out individual faces among the survivors. They were pointing at the helicopter, some waving with desperate enthusiasm, others simply staring in apparent disbelief that anyone would attempt a rescue in these conditions. The platform's emergency lights strobed through the storm, creating an eerie kaleidoscope effect against the driving rain. "Beginning final approach," Elena announced, fighting the controls as a massive downdraft tried to slam them into the churning water. "Sarah, talk me through the wind patterns. I need to know what's hitting us before it does." "Roger that, ma'am. Winds coming from 340 at 180, but we're getting rotors off the rig's superstructure. Every few seconds there's a lull, then a slam from the northeast. There, feel that?" Elena did feel it, a sudden calm that lasted maybe 2 seconds before another gust tried to flip them inverted. This was going to require timing, precision, and a level of aircraft control that pushed both pilot and machine far beyond their design limits. As she maneuvered the Widowmaker into position above the oil rig's landing pad, Elena found herself thinking about the metal spinning from her instrument panel. Her grandmother had worn it through the Depression, through the uncertainty of raising 6 children while her husband worked in the fields. "Mia," she'd said in her heavily accented English, "San Cristobal protects travelers, but he only helps those who help themselves." The helicopter shuddered as another massive gust caught it, and Elena realized that in the next few minutes, she was about to find out just how much help she could expect from the patron saint of travelers, and how much she'd have to provide herself. The question that haunted her as she fought to hold position wasn't whether she could save the people below. The question was whether the Widowmaker would hold together long enough to find out. 3 hours before, Hurricane Omega had forced her into this impossible position. Elena Vasquez had been sitting in the squadron ready room, nursing her third cup of coffee and pretending to read a technical manual while actually watching the Weather Channel's coverage of the approaching storm. The meteorologist's voice had carried that particular blend of excitement and dread, reserved for once-in-a-lifetime weather events. "Hurricane Omega continues to intensify as it approaches the Gulf Coast," the forecaster had intoned, standing before a satellite image that looked like the eye of an angry god. "Wind speeds have increased to 185 miles per hour, making this a strong Category 5 storm. The National Hurricane Center is calling it the most powerful hurricane to threaten the United States mainland in recorded history." Elena had glanced around the ready room at her fellow pilots, noting the mixture of anticipation and anxiety on their faces. Lieutenant Commander Jake Harrison, golden boy of the squadron with his perfect record and even more perfect teeth, had been holding court near the coffee machine, regaling the younger pilots with stories of his previous hurricane rescues. Captain Maria Santos, the squadron's executive officer, had been reviewing flight schedules with the grim efficiency of someone who knew that, in a few hours, those schedules would become meaningless. And then there was Elena, sitting alone, signals would become meaningless. The corner with the Widowmaker's maintenance logs spread across the table like evidence in a criminal trial. The helicopter's service record read like a catalog of near disasters: emergency auto-rotations due to engine failure, hydraulic system malfunctions that had left pilots wrestling with controls that felt like they were filled with concrete, and That infamous incident 6 months ago when the main rotor hub had cracked during a training flight, nearly killing Lieutenant Peterson and his crew. She'd traced her finger along the maintenance entries, noting the pattern of Band-Aid repairs and deferred maintenance that had kept the Widowmaker barely airworthy. New rotor hub, deferred pending budget approval. Hydraulic system overhaul, scheduled for next quarter. Engine replacement, under review by Maintenance Command. Still babysitting the hangar queen, Vasquez. Elena had looked up to find Commander Thomas Bradley standing over her table, his arms crossed and his expression mixing condescension with what might have been genuine concern. Bradley had been her commanding officer for 2 years, and in that time, he'd made it clear that he considered her assignment to the Widowmaker both appropriate and temporary. "Just familiarizing myself with her quirks, sir," Elena had replied, keeping her voice level despite the familiar surge of frustration. "In case we get called up for storm operations." Bradley had snorted, a sound that somehow managed to convey both amusement and dismissal. "Storm operations are for pilots with reliable aircraft, Captain. You'll be staying on base, providing communications support. We can't risk losing crews to equipment failure when lives are on the line." The words had stung because they carried the weight of institutional logic. The Navy's rescue protocols were clear. Use the best equipment for the most critical missions. That meant the squadron's newest MH-60R Seahawks would go to Harrison and Santos, while Elena remained grounded with an aircraft that 3 different maintenance chiefs had recommended for retirement. But as Elena had watched Bradley walk away, she'd felt the familiar fire kindle in her chest, the same determination that had carried her through flight school when her instructor suggested she might be better suited for a ground-based career. The same stubborn pride that had kept her flying when a hydraulic failure over the Atlantic had left her wrestling with dead controls for 20 terrifying minutes. Her phone had buzzed with a text message from her brother Miguel. "Saw the weather report. Stay safe up there, Hermana. Mom's lighting candles for you at church." Elena had smiled despite her frustration. Miguel was finishing his residency at Los Angeles General Hospital, working 18-hour shifts in the emergency room while studying for his board certification in trauma surgery. The money she'd sent home over the years had paid for his medical school, and now he was weeks away from becoming the doctor their family had always dreamed of having. She'd typed back, "Tell Mom I appreciate the prayers. Going to need them." What she hadn't told him was that those prayers might be tested sooner than any of them expected. Elena had a feeling about Hurricane Omega, a pilot's intuition, honed by years of flying into situations that looked impossible on paper, but somehow worked out when approached with the right combination of skill and calculated recklessness. The ready room had gradually emptied as pilots were called to their aircraft, leaving Elena alone with her coffee and her thoughts. Through the windows, she could see the Widowmaker sitting on the tarmac, her olive drab paint faded and streaked with oil stains. The helicopter looked tired, beaten down by years of hard service and deferred maintenance. But Elena knew something that the maintenance logs and official reports didn't capture. She'd flown the Widowmaker in conditions that should have been impossible, coaxing performance from her damaged systems through a combination of mechanical sympathy and pure pilot skill. She knew exactly how the aircraft behaved when pushed to her limits, understood the subtle cues that warned of impending system failures, and most importantly, she'd learned to work with the helicopter's quirks instead of fighting against them. 6 months ago, when Lieutenant Peterson had nearly died in the Widowmaker's rotor hub failure, Elena had been the one to analyze the incident report and identify the warning signs that had been missed. The crack in the hub had been developing for weeks, creating a subtle vibration pattern that an experienced pilot should have recognized. Peterson, flying the helicopter for the first time, had dismissed the unusual handling characteristics as normal for an older aircraft. Elena had spent hours studying the Widowmaker's maintenance records after that incident, creating her own informal checklist of warning signs and operational limits. She'd learned to read the helicopter's moods like a horse trainer, reading a difficult stallion, knowing when to push and when to back off, understanding the difference between mechanical complaint and genuine distress. The irony was bitter and perfect. The same aircraft that her superiors considered too dangerous for routine operations might be the only one capable of the kind of extreme weather flying that Hurricane Omega would demand. The F-35s, for all their technological superiority, were built for speed and precision combat. They weren't designed to hover in hurricane-force winds or maintain stability while performing rescue hoists in impossible conditions. Elena's coffee had gone cold as she'd stared out at the approaching storm clouds, watching the first bands of rain sweep across the airfield. The base's emergency sirens had been wailing intermittently, calling ground crews to secure equipment and prepare for the hurricane's arrival. Her mind had wandered to her grandmother's stories about flying not in helicopters, but as a young woman escaping Mexico during the Revolution. "Sometimes, Mia," the old woman had said, "the worst horse is the only one brave enough to cross the dangerous bridge. The pretty horses, they know too much to be foolish." But regulations hadn't anticipated the Widowmaker, an aircraft so far below standard specifications that normal operational limits didn't apply. When your helicopter was already held together by determination and creative maintenance, the line between acceptable risk and suicidal foolishness became surprisingly flexible. "Ma'am, we're getting some unusual readings from the tail rotor," Sarah reported, her voice tight with concern. "The blade pitch indicators are fluctuating, and I'm seeing intermittent loss of anti-torque effectiveness." Elena felt her stomach drop. The tail rotor failure scenario was every helicopter pilot's nightmare. Without anti-torque control, the aircraft would spin uncontrollably, making controlled flight impossible. In normal conditions, a tail rotor problem meant an immediate emergency. Landing. In a Category 5 hurricane, 40 miles from shore, it meant certain death. "How bad is it, Chief?" "Right now, manageable. But if we lose more effectiveness, we're going to start yawing uncontrollably. The good news is that the wind patterns are so chaotic that the torque isn't building consistently in one direction." Elena almost laughed at the irony. The same hurricane conditions that made the rescue nearly impossible were also providing the random wind forces that kept their damaged tail rotor from killing them immediately. Sometimes survival came down to finding the narrow space between two different types of disaster. "Oil rig Delta 7. This is Navy rescue helicopter Nomad 7. Please respond." The radio crackled with static before a voice emerged, heavily accented and edged with panic. "Nomad 7. This is Delta 7 platform supervisor Carlos Mendoza. Are you really out there? We saw the Air Force fighters turn back an hour ago. We're here, Delta 7. What's your current status?" "We've got 47 souls on board, including 3 injured from when the derrick collapsed. The platform is listing 12 degrees and taking on water. Emergency power is failing, and our weather monitoring shows wind gusts over 200 miles per hour. The waves are washing over the lower deck every few minutes." Elena digested this information while checking her fuel gauges. The stronger-than-predicted headwinds had increased their fuel consumption, leaving them with barely enough to reach the oil rig, complete a partial evacuation, and return to the nearest emergency landing site. Multiple trips would be impossible. "Delta 7, we're going to have to take everyone in one trip. I need you to organize your people by priority injured first, then essential personnel. Everyone needs to be wearing survival suits and ready to move fast once we're in position." "One trip?" "Nomad 7, this platform is 40 feet above sea level, and we're getting wave strikes that are shaking the entire structure." "How are you going to—" The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by static. Elena tried to raise the oil rig again, but received no response. Either their communications equipment had failed, or something worse had happened to the platform. "Ma'am, David." Chun's voice was carefully controlled. "I've been doing some calculations. 47 people plus crew plus equipment puts us significantly over maximum gross weight for these wind conditions. The power required to hover is going to push both engines into the red zone." Elena had been afraid of this. The Widowmaker's engines were already running hot, their cooling system struggling with the humidity and debris-laden air of the hurricane. Adding the weight of a full evacuation load would require power settings that could cause catastrophic engine failure. But as she looked at her instruments and felt the helicopter fighting against the storm's violence, Elena realized that catastrophic failure was already a statistical certainty. The question wasn't whether the Widowmaker would survive this mission intact. It was whether she could hold together long enough to complete the rescue. "David, Sarah, I need you both to understand what we're looking at here. This helicopter wasn't designed for what we're about to ask her to do. The engines are going to overheat, the rotor systems are going to be stressed beyond design limits, and we're going to be operating in weather conditions that no helicopter has ever successfully handled." Sarah Mitchell's response came without hesitation. "Ma'am, I've been flying with this bird for 2 years. She's held together through things that should have killed us all. If you're asking whether I think she's got one more impossible mission in her, my answer is yes." David Chun nodded emphatically. "I've seen what this crew can accomplish when everything goes wrong. If there's a way to save those people, we'll find it." Elena felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the overheated cabin. This was why she'd chosen to fly with Sarah and David instead of waiting for assignment to a crew with a newer aircraft and better equipment. Technical specifications meant nothing compared to the trust and determination of people who were willing to risk everything for strangers they'd never met. "All right then," Elena said, adjusting her grip on the controls as another massive gust tried to flip them inverted. "Let's go do something that's never been done before." The oil rig appeared through the storm like a vision from hell, a massive steel island being pounded by waves that looked like moving mountains. The platform's emergency lights strobed frantically through the driving rain, but Elena could see that the structure was listing even more severely than the supervisor had reported. The helicopter landing pad, normally 40 feet above sea level, was being washed by the largest waves, making any approach incredibly dangerous. "Jesus," Sarah whispered over the intercom. "How are we going to get close enough for a hoist operation?" Elena studied the oil rig's configuration, looking for any advantage she could exploit. The platform's superstructure was creating wind shadows and turbulent air patterns that were actually worse than the open ocean conditions. But there was a narrow window, maybe 30 seconds between the largest wave sets, when the landing pad might be clear enough for a quick approach. "We're going to have to time it perfectly," Elena said. "Sarah, I need you to watch the wave patterns and call out the windows. David, once we're in position, you're going to have to work faster than you've ever worked in your life." As they approached the oil rig, Elena could see people clustered on the landing pad, their orange survival suits bright against the gray steel of the platform. They were holding onto safety lines, bracing themselves against the wind and spray, looking up at the Widowmaker with expressions that mixed hope and disbelief. "Ma'am," Sarah's voice was tense, "I count 47 people on that platform, just like they reported. But look at the way they're positioned. Some of them aren't moving very well. We might have more injuries than they initially reported." Elena could see what Sarah meant. Several of the figures on the platform were being supported by others, suggesting injuries serious enough to affect mobility. In normal rescue conditions, this would mean individual hoist operations and careful medical assessment. In Hurricane Omega, it meant Elena would have to hover the Widowmaker in position while David and Sarah performed what amounted to battlefield medicine 40 feet above an ocean gone mad. "Beginning approach," Elena announced. feeling the helicopters. Controls become increasingly heavy as she fought to maintain position. The Widowmaker was shuddering continuously now, every rivet and weld being tested by forces that exceeded the aircraft's design specifications. But as she maneuvered into position above the oil rig, Elena felt the familiar calm that came with accepting the impossible. This was what she'd trained for, what every hour of flight time had been preparing her to accomplish. Not the safe routine missions that earned commendations and career advancement, but the ones that mattered when ordinary people found themselves in extraordinary danger and needed someone willing to risk everything to bring them home, the first. Rescue was about to begin, and Elena knew with absolute certainty that before it was over, both she and the Widowmaker would be tested far beyond anything they'd ever imagined possible. The first person Elena pulled from the oil rig was Maria Santos, not the squadron executive officer, but a 63-year-old cook from Galveston, whose weathered hands had prepared meals for offshore workers for 37 years. As David Chen secured her in the rescue basket, Elena realized that this woman represented everything the Navy's risk. Assessment protocols couldn't quantify the human cost of walking away from an impossible mission. Maria's eyes were wide with terror and wonder as the basket rose through the hurricane's fury, buffeted by winds that should have torn any rescue operation apart. Through the headset David had placed on her, Elena could hear her whispering prayers in Spanish, the same words Elena's grandmother had taught her as a child. Santa Maria, Madre de Dios, ruega por nosotros pecadores. Elena felt tears mixing with the rain on her face as she fought to hold the Widowmaker steady. This wasn't about proving herself anymore, or defying the institutional prejudices that had relegated her to flying broken equipment. This was about Maria Santos and 46 other human beings who deserved to live, regardless of what some computer algorithm said about acceptable risk parameters. "Basket secure," David reported, his voice strained from the physical effort of operating the hoist in impossible conditions. 1 down, 46 to go. But as Elena began maneuvering for the second pickup, Sarah Mitchell's voice cut through the intercom with devastating news. "Ma'am, we just lost primary hydraulics. I'm showing complete system failure across the board. We're flying on backup systems only." Elena felt her blood turn to ice. Flying a helicopter without primary hydraulics was like trying to steer a truck with the power steering disconnected possible, but requiring enormous physical strength and making precise control nearly impossible. In hurricane conditions, with a damaged aircraft and a full rescue operation in progress, it was essentially a death sentence. How long do we have on backup systems? In normal conditions, maybe 20 minutes. In this storm, with the power demands we're putting on the aircraft, I'd say 10 minutes if we're lucky. Elena did the math. 46 people remaining, 10 minutes of hydraulic power, and weather conditions that made each individual rescue a test of both pilot skill and mechanical endurance. The numbers didn't work. It was mathematically impossible to complete the evacuation before the helicopter became unflyable. She was about to voice this conclusion when David Shun's voice stopped her cold. "Ma'am, the woman we just picked up, Maria, she's telling me something about her grandson. He's a Navy pilot, stationed at NAS Corpus Christi. She says his name is Lieutenant Miguel Santos." Elena's heart skipped a beat. She knew Miguel Santos, a young pilot fresh out of flight school, assigned to the same squadron but flying one of the newer Seahawks. She'd mentored him during his first months at the base, helping him navigate the complex social dynamics of a squadron where lineage and connections often mattered more than competence. "David, ask her about his call sign." There was a brief pause as David translated the question into Spanish. "She says the other pilots call him Rookie, but his real call sign is Corazon Heart, because he always volunteers for the dangerous missions." Elena felt a connection snap into place, a recognition that went beyond mere coincidence. Miguel Santos was one of the few pilots in the squadron who had treated her with genuine respect from the beginning, who had sought her advice. Not because regulations required it, but because he recognized her expertise. He'd been scheduled to fly one of the F-35 rescue missions that had been aborted due to weather conditions. "Ma'am," Sarah's voice carried a note of urgency, "we need to make a decision about continuing the rescue. With backup hydraulics only. Every minute we stay in position is pushing us closer to complete control failure." Elena looked down at the oil rig, where 46 people were still clustered on the platform, watching the Widowmaker with desperate hope. Among them was Carlos Mendoza, the platform supervisor whose panicked radio calls had drawn them into this impossible situation. Elena could see him organizing the remaining evacuees, prioritizing the injured and the elderly, preparing for a rescue operation that every rational calculation said couldn't be completed. But as she watched the people below, Elena began to notice something that changed everything. The oil rig workers weren't just standing around waiting to be rescued, they were actively helping each other. The stronger workers were supporting the injured, sharing their safety lines and survival gear, creating human chains to move people efficiently toward the rescue basket. They'd turned what should have been a chaotic evacuation into a coordinated operation that maximized their chances of survival. "David, Sarah, look at them. Really look at them." Both crew members followed Elena's gaze down to the platform, and she could hear the shift in their breathing as they recognized what she was seeing. "They're not just waiting to be saved," Sarah said quietly. "They're saving each other. The strong ones are giving up their places in line to help the weak ones," David added. "That's not standard evacuation protocol. That's something else entirely." Elena felt a clarity descend over her that cut through the storm's chaos like a blade. This wasn't about following regulations or exceeding aircraft limitations. This was about people choosing to be better than their circumstances, to help each other survive when survival seemed impossible. "Here's what we're going to do," Elena announced, her voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "We're going to modify our approach. Instead of individual basket rescues, we're going to land on that platform." "Ma'am," Sarah's voice was carefully controlled. "Landing on an oil rig in Category 5 conditions has never been successfully attempted. The rotor wash alone could blow people off the platform. Then we'll make it work," Elena replied. "David, I need you to coordinate with the platform supervisor. Tell him we're coming in for a full landing. I want everyone ready to board immediately injured first, then as many others as we can safely carry." As Elena began her approach to the oil rig's landing pad, she felt the Widowmaker responding to her inputs with the sluggish, unpredictable behavior of a helicopter operating far beyond its design limits. The backup hydraulic systems were already showing signs of strain, and the engine temperature gauges were climbing into the red zone. But something extraordinary was happening on the platform below. Carlos Mendoza had received David's message and was organizing the evacuation with military precision. The oil rig workers had formed efficient lines, with the strongest individuals positioned to help load the injured and elderly. They'd secured loose equipment and cleared debris from the landing area, creating as safe an environment as possible under impossible circumstances. "Ma'am, I'm getting reports from other rescue units," Sarah said. "The Coast Guard is monitoring our frequency, and they're requesting updates on our status. Apparently, word has gotten out about what we're attempting." Elena keyed her microphone to the emergency frequency. "Coast Guard Rescue Coordination Center. This is Navy Helicopter Nomad 7. We are conducting rescue operations at oil rig Delta 7. In Category 5 conditions. Request that all other aircraft maintain safe distance." The response was immediate and incredulous. "Nomad 7, Coast Guard RCC. We show all military aircraft have returned to base due to extreme weather. Please confirm." your position and operational status. Coast Guard RCC. Nomad 7 is currently conducting helicopter evacuation of 47 souls from oil rig Delta 7. Aircraft is operational despite mechanical issues. We will complete this mission. There was a long pause before the Coast Guard coordinator responded, his voice mixing admiration with disbelief. Nomad 7 understood. Be advised that you are attempting a rescue operation in conditions that exceed all established safety parameters. We have emergency medical teams standing by at multiple landing sites. As Elena brought the Widowmaker into final approach, she could see the faces of the people waiting on the platform. These weren't the anonymous statistics of a mission briefing. They were individuals with families, dreams, and stories that mattered. Maria Santos had a grandson who flew helicopters. Carlos Mendoza wore a wedding ring that caught the emergency lights as he waved his arms to guide her approach. A young woman in an oil-stained coverall was helping an older man with an injured leg, her face set with determination that reminded Elena of herself at that age. Beginning landing sequence. Elena announced, feeling the Widowmaker settle toward the platform with agonizing slowness. Every foot of descent was a victory over aerodynamics and common sense, a testament to the helicopter's stubborn refusal to quit, despite being pushed far beyond rational limits. The platform's landing pad was smaller than Elena had realized, designed for crew changes in calm weather rather than emergency evacuations in hurricane conditions. As the helicopter's skids touched down on the rain-slicked metal, Elena could feel the aircraft being buffeted by wind gusts that threatened to push them over the platform's edge into the churning ocean below. Landing secure, Sarah reported. But ma'am, we can't stay here long. The wind loading on the rotor disc is enormous, and I'm seeing stress indicators that are off the charts. Elena kept the engines running and the rotors turning, knowing that if she shut down the Widowmaker in these conditions, they might never get her started again. Through the cabin windows, she could see the oil rig workers moving with desperate efficiency, loading the injured first, and then filling every available seat with as many people as the helicopter could safely carry. Carlos Mendoza appeared at the cabin door, his face streaming with rain and sea spray. Captain, we can get 22 people in this load, including the 3 critically injured. But that leaves 25 still on the platform. Elena felt her heart sink. Even if the Widowmaker could survive this takeoff and make it back to shore, they wouldn't have time for a second trip. The backup hydraulic systems were already showing signs of failure, and the engines were running so hot that warning lights were flashing across the instrument panel like a Christmas tree. But as she looked at the 25 people who would have to remain behind, Elena saw something that changed her perspective entirely. They weren't looking at her with accusation or despair. Instead, they were helping to secure the others in the helicopter, making sure the injured were properly strapped in and the survival equipment was distributed correctly. Captain, Carlos shouted over the rotor noise, the people staying behind, they volunteered. The young ones, the strong ones. They're giving their seats to the families and the injured. They said they'll wait for the Coast Guard or ride out the storm on the platform. Elena felt tears streaming down her face as she realized what she was witnessing. These weren't just random oil workers facing a natural disaster. They were ordinary people making extraordinary choices, demonstrating the kind of courage and selflessness that military awards and commendations were supposed to recognize, but rarely captured. Tell them, Elena said, her voice thick with emotion. Tell them that heroes come in all different uniforms, and that I'll be back for them if it's humanly possible. As the Widowmaker lifted off from the oil rig with 22 survivors aboard, Elena felt the helicopter respond with the sluggish, unpredictable behavior of an aircraft pushed far beyond its operational envelope. The additional weight was straining every system. The engines were overheating dramatically, and the backup hydraulic systems were beginning to fail. But as she turned toward shore, Elena caught sight of something that made her heart race with hope. On the horizon, barely visible through the storm, were the lights of several aircraft converging on their position. The Coast Guard had scrambled everything they had: helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, and surface vessels, creating a rescue armada that was preparing to extract the remaining 25 workers from the oil rig. "Ma'am," David Chun's voice was filled with wonder, "I'm monitoring Coast Guard frequencies. They're calling this the largest rescue coordination in Gulf Coast history. Every available aircraft is being deployed, and they're all using our mission as the template for hurricane rescue operations." Elena realized that what had started as an impossible mission by a single crew in a broken helicopter had become something much larger. The Widowmaker's success had proven that Category 5 hurricane rescues were possible, inspiring other pilots and crews to attempt operations they'd previously considered suicidal. But more importantly, the oil rig workers' example of selflessness and mutual aid had demonstrated something that military training manuals couldn't teach: that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, were capable of heroism that transcended regulations and protocols. As the Widowmaker limped toward shore with its precious cargo, Elena felt a profound shift in her understanding of what it meant to serve. It wasn't about flying the newest aircraft or following the safest procedures. It was about being willing to risk everything when people needed help, and having the skill and determination to make the impossible routine. The recognition she'd been seeking her entire career hadn't come from superior officers or official commendations. It had come from 22 survivors who owed their lives to a pilot who refused to accept impossible as an answer, and 25 volunteers who had chosen to stay behind so others could live. 6 months after Hurricane Omega, Elena Vasquez stood before a joint session of Congress, wearing her dress blue uniform and holding a leather portfolio containing photographs that would change military rescue doctrine forever. The hearing room was packed with media representatives, military officials, and family members of the oil rig survivors, their faces reflecting a mixture of pride and anticipation. Captain Vasquez, Senator Patricia Chun, addressed her from the dais. "Your rescue mission during Hurricane Omega has been described as impossible by aviation experts and miraculous by the survivors. Today, we want to understand not just what you accomplished, but how your actions have transformed our approach to emergency response." Elena adjusted the microphone and looked out at the assembled crowd, noting familiar faces among the spectators. Maria Santos sat in the front row, her grandson Lieutenant Miguel Santos beside her in his dress whites. Carlos Mendoza, the oil rig supervisor, had flown in from Texas with 17 other survivors. Most remarkably, all 25 workers who had volunteered to stay behind during the first rescue were present, having been successfully evacuated by the Coast Guard operation that followed. "Senators, what happened during Hurricane Omega wasn't the result of individual heroism or exceptional skill," Elena began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed chamber. "It was the result of people choosing to do what was right instead of what was safe, and institutions finally recognizing that courage shouldn't be constrained by outdated regulations." She opened her portfolio and displayed the first photograph, the Widowmaker sitting on the tarmac at NAS Corpus Christi, her olive drab paint scarred by salt spray, and her maintenance panels open to reveal the extensive repairs required after the hurricane mission. This helicopter, hull number 8724613, was scheduled for retirement the week after Hurricane Omega. According to official maintenance reports, she was unfit for operational service and represented an unacceptable risk to crew safety. Elena paused, letting the implications sink in before continuing. That same aircraft completed a rescue mission that 4 F-35 Lightning II fighters couldn't attempt, saving 47 lives in conditions that exceeded every established safety parameter. Senator Robert Harrison, a former Navy pilot himself, leaned forward with interest. Captain, are you suggesting that our safety protocols are too restrictive? No, sir. I'm suggesting that our definition of safety needs to be expanded to include the people we're trying to save. The safest course of action for my crew and aircraft would have been to remain on base during the hurricane. But the safest course of action for 47 oil rig workers was for someone to risk everything to reach them. Elena displayed another photograph, this one showing the oil rig workers organizing themselves during the evacuation, with the strongest individuals helping the injured and elderly, while voluntarily giving up their own places in the rescue queue. What we learned during Hurricane Omega wasn't just about aircraft capabilities or pilot skill. We learned that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, are capable of heroism that our regulations and protocols don't account for. Chief Petty Officer Sarah Mitchell stood up in the gallery, still wearing the cast on her left arm that she'd earned during the Widowmaker's emergency landing 6 months earlier. "Ma'am, permission to speak?" Senator Chun nodded, and Sarah approached the witness microphone with the measured gait of a career military professional. "Senators, I've been flying rescue missions for 22 years, and I can tell you that what Captain Vasquez accomplished wasn't luck or accident. It was the result of years of training with substandard equipment, learning to do more with less, and developing the kind of mechanical sympathy that you can't get from flying perfect aircraft." Sarah gestured toward Elena with obvious respect. Every pilot in our squadron wanted assignment to the newer Seahawks. Captain Vasquez got stuck with the Widowmaker because some people thought she needed to prove herself before earning better equipment. What actually happened was that she became the only pilot capable of flying a mission that perfect equipment couldn't handle. Hospital Corpsman David Chun approached the microphone next, his young face serious but confident. "Senators, during the hurricane rescue, I watched 47 people organize themselves into the most efficient evacuation I've ever seen. They triaged their own injuries, shared survival equipment, and voluntarily gave up rescue seats to help others. That's not something you can teach in a manual or simulate in training." Elena felt a warmth spread through her chest as she listened to her crew members' testimony. The bond forged during Hurricane Omega had transcended military hierarchy and professional relationships, creating a connection based on shared understanding of what was truly possible when people refused to accept artificial limitations. "Captain Vasquez," Senator Chun continued, "your mission report included a recommendation for changes to military rescue doctrine. Can you summarize those recommendations?" Elena stood and addressed the assembled legislators with the confidence of someone who had already proven her points under the most extreme conditions imaginable. "First, we need to reconsider our approach to aircraft maintenance and operational readiness. Instead of retiring older aircraft that require more intensive maintenance, we should be using them to train pilots in the kind of adaptability and mechanical understanding that perfect equipment can't teach." She displayed a technical diagram showing the Widowmaker's modifications and improvements following the hurricane mission. After Hurricane Omega, Navy engineers studied our aircraft's performance and identified 17 modifications that could be applied to the entire helicopter fleet. Many of these improvements came from understanding how damaged systems could still provide operational capability when handled by experienced crews. "Second," Elena continued, "we need to expand our definition of operational capability to include extreme weather rescue missions. Hurricane Omega proved that Category 5 conditions don't automatically preclude helicopter operations, but they do require specialized training, modified procedures, and aircraft configured specifically for extreme environment operations." Senator Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "And your third recommendation?" "We need to recognize that the most valuable military asset isn't advanced technology or perfect equipment. It's people who are willing to risk everything when others need help." The oil rig workers who volunteered to stay behind during our first rescue demonstrated the same courage and selflessness that we're supposed to be defending. Our military culture should celebrate and develop that kind of character, not just technical proficiency. Elena displayed her final photograph, the Widowmaker taking off from the oil rig platform with 22 survivors aboard. Her rotor disc tilted against the hurricane's fury, while the remaining workers watched from below, their faces showing. Not despair, but determination to help others survive. This image represents everything the military is supposed to stand for. Ordinary people choosing to do extraordinary things, using whatever resources are available, refusing to abandon those who need help regardless of the personal cost. Maria Santos stood up in the gallery, her weathered hands clutching a small American flag. "Excuse me, senators. I'm not military, I'm just a cook from Galveston. But I want you to know that Captain Vasquez and her crew didn't save 47 oil workers that day. They saved 47 families, 47 stories, 47 futures that wouldn't exist without their courage." The hearing room erupted in sustained applause as other survivors and family members rose to their feet. Elena felt tears streaming down her face as she realized that the recognition she'd been seeking her entire career wasn't coming from military officials or political leaders. It was coming from the people whose lives she'd helped save. 3 weeks after the congressional hearing, Elena received orders that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. She was being promoted to major and assigned as the commanding officer of the Navy's new Extreme Weather Rescue Squadron, based at Corpus Christi and equipped with a fleet of specially modified helicopters designed for operations and conditions previously considered impossible. The squadron's first aircraft was hull number 87244613, the Widowmaker herself, rebuilt from the ground up with improvements derived from her Hurricane Omega performance. But instead of receiving a new designation, the helicopter retained her old nickname, painted in bright yellow letters across her nose: Widowmaker Hurricane Omega Survivor. Elena's new office overlooked the hangar where the Widowmaker sat, surrounded by her sister aircraft, all of them bearing the scars and modifications that marked them as veterans of impossible missions. Through her windows, she could watch young pilots learning to fly with the same kind of damaged equipment that had taught her to find capability in unexpected places. Lieutenant Miguel Santos knocked on her door one afternoon, carrying a manila folder and wearing the confident expression of a pilot who had recently completed his first extreme weather rescue mission. "Ma'am, I've got the after-action report from yesterday's storm rescue. 12 survivors pulled from a fishing vessel in 60-knot winds, 0 casualties, minimal aircraft damage." Elena smiled as she reviewed the report. Miguel had taken everything she'd taught him about flying broken aircraft and applied it to a mission that would have been aborted under the old safety protocols. "How did the Widowmaker handle?" "Like she was built for this, ma'am. The modifications work perfectly, but more importantly, I think I'm finally understanding what you meant about mechanical sympathy. She's not a broken helicopter anymore. She's a specialized tool for doing things that perfect aircraft can't handle." Elena nodded, remembering her own journey from maintenance crew to squadron commander, from flying rejected equipment to leading the most advanced rescue unit in the military. "Miguel, the most important thing I can teach you is that regulations and limitations are starting points, not ending points. When people need help, our job is to find a way to reach them, regardless of what the manual says is possible." As evening fell over Corpus Christi, Elena walked out to the flight line where the Widowmaker sat ready for the next impossible mission. The St. Christopher medal still hung from the instrument panel, spinning gently in the Gulf breeze. Elena touched it softly, thinking of her grandmother's words about travelers and the horses brave enough to cross dangerous bridges. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to a message from her brother Miguel, now Dr. Miguel Vasquez, Chief of Emergency Medicine at Los Angeles General Hospital. "Hermana saw your interview on the news tonight. Mom wanted me to tell you she's proud, but she's also worried about you flying into hurricanes. I told her not to worry, you've been doing impossible things your whole life. Love you. Elena typed back, tell Mom that some bridges can only be crossed by people willing to risk everything for others. And that her prayers work. 47 families can testify to that. As she walked back toward the squadron-ready room, Elena, past the memorial wall where photographs of fallen aviators reminded every pilot of the ultimate cost of their profession. But tonight, she was thinking about a different kind of memorial, the 47 oil rig survivors who were living their lives, raising their families, and pursuing their dreams because someone had refused to accept impossible as an answer. Legacy of Hurricane Omega wasn't measured in medals or promotions. It was measured in birthdays celebrated, grandchildren born, and dreams fulfilled by people who had been given a second chance at life by a crew flying a broken helicopter into a storm that should have killed them all. Elena Vasquez had finally earned the recognition she'd been seeking her entire career. But more importantly, she'd learned that true recognition came not from superior officers or government officials, but from ordinary people whose lives had been touched by extraordinary courage. The Widowmaker sat ready for the next mission, her battle scars proud and her spirit unbroken. Tomorrow there would be other storms, other impossible rescues, other opportunities to prove that courage could overcome any limitation. But tonight, Elena was content to watch the sunset over the Gulf of Mexico, knowing that somewhere in the distance, 47 families were sharing dinner together because a broken helicopter had refused to quit when quitting would have been safer. Commander Elena Vasquez stood on the flight deck of the USS Intrepid, watching her pilots prepare for a rescue mission that would have been impossible before Hurricane Omega. The aircraft carrier was positioned 200 miles southeast of Miami, where Hurricane Patricia Category 6 storm that represented a new classification created after Omega was bearing down on a cruise ship with 4,000 passengers aboard. The helicopters lined up on the flight deck weren't the standard Navy aircraft of 5 years ago. They were specially modified MH-6 OX Stormhawks, designed specifically for extreme weather operations and bearing the distinctive yellow lightning bolt insignia of the Extreme Weather Rescue Squadron. Each aircraft incorporated lessons learned from the Widowmaker's impossible mission, from improved hydraulic systems to reinforced rotor hubs, capable of handling forces that would have destroyed their predecessors. But the most important changes weren't technological. They were human. Lieutenant Commander Miguel Santos approached Elena with a mission briefing folder, his confident stride reflecting 5 years of experience flying impossible missions in impossible conditions. The young pilot who had once doubted his own capabilities had become one of the squadron's most skilled instructors, training a new generation of aviators to find opportunity in adversity. Ma'am, we've got updated weather reports from the storm penetration aircraft. Patricia is generating sustained winds of 210 miles per hour, with wave heights exceeding 80 feet. The cruise ship is taking on water and has lost propulsion. Elena reviewed the briefing materials, noting the environmental conditions that would have grounded every aircraft in the Navy 6 years earlier. Today, they represented challenging but manageable operational parameters for pilots, trained to push beyond traditional limitations. How many birds are we launching? 6 Stormhawks for the initial wave, plus 2 backup aircraft standing by. Each crew has completed advanced extreme weather certification, and we've got coordination with Coast Guard assets positioning for passenger transfer operations. Elena nodded, remembering the lonely terror of approaching the oil rig in Hurricane Omega with no backup, no support, and no certainty that the Widowmaker would hold together long enough to complete the mission. Today's operation involved dozens of aircraft, hundreds of personnel, and coordination between multiple military and civilian agencies, all made possible by proving that impossible was often just another word for untried. As the first Stormhawk lifted off from the carrier deck, Elena felt the familiar mixture of pride and anxiety that accompanied every rescue mission. These were her pilots, trained in her methods, flying aircraft improved by her innovations. But they were also individual human beings with families and dreams, risking their lives for strangers they'd never meet. Commander, Chief Petty Officer Sarah Mitchell, approached from the Flight Operations Center, her gray hair now completely white, but her eyes as sharp as ever. "We're getting reports from the cruise ship. The passengers are organizing themselves into evacuation groups, prioritizing families with children and elderly passengers." Sound familiar? Elena smiled at the observation. In the 5 years since Hurricane Omega, the concept of survivor self-organization had become a standard component of emergency response doctrine. Training programs now taught civilians how to assist in their own rescues, how to prioritize evacuees, and how to maintain morale during extended emergency situations. "Sarah, do you ever think about what would have happened if we'd followed regulations that day?" The veteran crew chief was quiet for a moment, watching the Stormhawks disappear into the distance toward Hurricane Patricia. "Ma'am, I think about it every time we launch a mission like this. 47 people would have died, and we'd still be telling ourselves that Category 5 conditions are impossible for helicopter operations." Elena nodded, but her thoughts had moved beyond the immediate consequences of that long-ago decision. Hurricane Omega had changed more than military rescue doctrine. It had demonstrated that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary courage when circumstances demanded it, and that institutions could evolve beyond their traditional limitations. When leadership was willing to take calculated risks, 10 years later, Elena Vasquez Chun stood at the podium of the International Emergency Response Conference in Geneva, Switzerland, looking out at an audience of military officers, civilian rescue specialists, and government officials from 43 countries. The woman who had once been relegated to flying broken helicopters was now recognized as the world's leading authority on extreme weather rescue operations. Behind her, a massive screen displayed satellite imagery of Hurricane Zeta, a Category 7 storm, another new classification that was threatening the eastern seaboard of the United States. The storm's wind speeds exceeded anything previously recorded, but the evacuation operations being coordinated by multiple agencies represented capabilities that hadn't existed a decade earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elena began, 10 years ago, the international community considered Category 5 hurricanes to be unsurvivable for rescue operations. Today, we routinely conduct evacuations in Category 6 and 7 conditions, saving thousands of lives annually that would have been written off as acceptable losses under the old paradigm. She clicked to the next slide, showing a photograph of the Widowmaker in her retirement display at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, surrounded by plaques describing her role in revolutionizing emergency response doctrine. But the real revolution wasn't technological. It was psychological. We learned that the difference between impossible and difficult often comes down to willingness to accept risk in service of others, and the institutional courage to support individuals who are willing to push beyond established boundaries. Elena advanced to a slide showing survival statistics from major natural disasters over the past decade, the numbers representing a dramatic improvement in rescue success rates across all categories of extreme weather events. The Hurricane Omega model has been applied to earthquake rescue operations in Turkey, tsunami response in Indonesia, and wildfire evacuations in Australia. The common factor in every successful application has been the recognition that ordinary people, when properly supported and trained, are capable of participating in their own rescue and the rescue of others. A hand rose from the audience, a young woman in the uniform of the Brazilian Air Force. "Dr. Vasquez, can you speak to the personal cost of pioneering these techniques? The psychological impact on rescue personnel who are asked to exceed traditional safety parameters?" Elena paused, considering the question that touched on aspects of her experience she rarely discussed publicly. The years following Hurricane Omega had brought professional recognition and institutional change, but they had also included sleepless nights, recurring nightmares, and the constant weight of responsibility that came with being the person others looked to when situations seemed impossible. That's an excellent question, Lieutenant. The personal cost is real and significant. Pushing beyond established safety parameters requires not just technical skill, but psychological resilience that can be depleted over time. That's why the current extreme weather rescue doctrine includes mandatory psychological support, rotation policies that prevent burnout, and recognition that heroism isn't sustainable without institutional support. Elena clicked to a slide showing the current Extreme Weather Rescue Squadron, now expanded to include units on both coasts of the United States and training partnerships with allied nations worldwide. The faces in the photograph were younger than her original crew, but they carried the same expression of determined competence that she remembered from her own early days. The most important lesson from Hurricane Omega wasn't that regulation should be ignored, but that they should be continuously evolved based on actual capabilities rather than theoretical limitations. Every successful and possible mission becomes the foundation for new standard operating procedures that expand what's considered achievable. 15 years later, Elena Vasquez, now director of the International Emergency Response Institute, sat in her office overlooking Lake Geneva, reading a letter that had arrived that morning from Maria Santos in Galveston, Texas, the oil rig. Cook was now 83 years old, and her handwriting showed the slight tremor of advanced age, but her words carried the same warmth and gratitude that had sustained Elena through the difficult years of building new institutions and changing established doctrines. Dear Captain Elena, the letter began, using the rank Elena had held during Hurricane Omega, despite her subsequent promotions and career changes. I hope this letter finds you well and still fighting for people who need help. I wanted to let you know that my grandson Miguel graduated from medical school last month and has been accepted for a residency in emergency medicine. He tells everyone that he decided to become a doctor because he wanted to save lives the way his grandmother's life was saved. Elena smiled, remembering the young Navy pilot who had been so eager to prove himself 15 years earlier. Miguel Santos was now a veteran rescue pilot himself, commanding his own squadron and training the next generation of extreme weather specialists. The letter continued. I also wanted to tell you about my great-granddaughter Isabella. She's only 8 years old, but she told her teacher that when she grows up, she wants to be a helicopter pilot like the lady who saved her great-grandmother from the storm. I told her that the most important thing isn't the helicopter, it's having the courage to help people when they need it most. Elena set the letter aside and walked to her office window, looking out at the peaceful Swiss landscape that seemed so far removed from the chaos and violence of natural disasters. But she knew that somewhere in the world, extreme weather was threatening human lives, and the rescue techniques pioneered during Hurricane Omega were being applied by pilots and crews who had never heard her name but were carrying forward the legacy of refusing to accept impossible as an answer. Her phone buzzed with a text message from David Chun, now Dr. David Chun and Chief of Emergency Medicine at a trauma center in Houston. Elena, just wanted to let you know we used the Hurricane Omega triage protocols during yesterday's tornado outbreak. Saved an estimated 30 additional lives by having civilians assist in their own rescue operations. Still changing the world, one storm at a time. Elena typed back, the world changes itself, David. We just proved it was possible. 20 years later, the ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery was small and private, attended by family members, former crewmates, and a handful of military officials who understood the significance of the moment. Elena Vasquez Chun, now retired, From active duty, but still consulting on emergency response operations worldwide, stood beside a simple granite marker that read, UH6, O Black HAWK, hull number 8724613. The Widowmaker, Hurricane Omega survivor, she refused to quit. Chief Petty Officer Sarah Mitchell, now in her 70s but still sharp-eyed and confident, placed a wreath at the base of the memorial. Ma'am, it seems fitting that she got her own marker. That bird saved more lives than most pilots. Elena nodded, thinking about the helicopter that had been scheduled for retirement the week after Hurricane Omega, but had instead become the foundation for an entirely new approach to emergency response. The Widowmaker had finally been decommissioned 5 years earlier, after serving as a training aircraft for extreme weather operations and accumulating more rescue missions than any helicopter in Navy history. Hospital Corpsman David Chun, now graying but still enthusiastic, gestured toward a group of young people standing respectfully near the memorial. Ma'am, I wanted to introduce you to some special guests. These are students from the Hurricane Omega Leadership Academy kids, whose families were affected by extreme weather events and who are studying emergency response techniques. Elena approached the group and immediately recognized the spark of determination in their eyes that she'd seen in her own reflection 20 years earlier. Among them was a teenage girl with the confident posture of someone who had already decided to dedicate her life to helping others. Are you really the pilot who flew into Hurricane Omega? The girl asked, her voice mixing awe with the practical curiosity of someone who understood that heroes were real people who made difficult choices. I was one of the pilots, Elena replied carefully. But the real heroes were the 47. People who organized themselves during the evacuation, and the 25 who volunteered to stay behind so others could be rescued first. An older boy in the group stepped forward. My grandfather was Carlos Mendoza, the platform supervisor. He told me that what you did that day wasn't just about flying. It was about proving that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they had to. Elena felt a familiar warmth spread through her chest as she realized that the legacy of Hurricane Omega was being passed to a new generation, not as a story about individual heroism, but as a lesson about collective courage and the importance of refusing to abandon others when they needed help. Your grandfather was right, Elena said. The most important thing we learned during Hurricane Omega was that the line between possible and impossible is usually drawn by people who haven't been tested by real necessity. When 47 lives are at stake, you discover capabilities you didn't know you had. As the ceremony concluded and the attendees began to disperse, Elena found herself standing alone beside the Widowmaker's memorial, thinking about the impossible distance between that terrifying flight 20 years ago and this peaceful moment of remembrance. The helicopter that had been dismissed as broken and dangerous had become a symbol of the potential that existed in everything and everyone that society had written off as inadequate. 25 years later, the phone call came at 3:17 a.m., pulling Elena from sleep with the urgent ring that she'd learned to associate with natural disasters and human emergencies. At 71, she no longer flew rescue missions, but her expertise was still sought whenever extreme weather threatened human lives on a scale that challenged existing response capabilities. Dr. Vasquez Chun, this is Admiral Sarah Morrison. At Pacific Fleet Command, we have a situation developing in the Western Pacific that requires your consultation. Elena sat up in bed, immediately alert despite the early hour. Admiral Morrison was Sarah Mitchell's daughter, a career Navy officer who had grown up hearing stories about Hurricane Omega and had built her own distinguished career on the foundation of pushing beyond traditional limitations. What's the situation? Admiral, Super Typhoon. Xavier is approaching the Philippines with wind speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour Category 8 conditions that we've never dealt with before. There are approximately 15,000 people on various islands in the storm's path, and conventional evacuation methods are insufficient for the scale and timeline involved. Elena felt her pulse quicken as she absorbed the magnitude of the challenge. Category 8 was theoretical territory, conditions so extreme that no existing aircraft or vessels were designed to operate in them. But she'd learned long ago that theoretical limitations were often overcome by practical necessity and creative problem-solving. Admiral, what resources do you have available? The full Pacific Fleet extreme weather rescue capability, plus coordination with civilian agencies and international partners. But ma'am, we're looking at conditions that exceed anything in our operational envelope. We need someone who understands how to make the impossible routine. Elena smiled in the darkness of her bedroom, remembering a similar conversation 25 years earlier when a young captain had been told that flying into Hurricane Omega was impossible according to all established parameters. Admiral, send me the meteorological data and resource assessments. And Admiral? Yes, ma'am? Start planning for success, not failure. 15,000 people are counting on us to find a way. As Elena ended the call and began preparing for what would likely be another career-defining challenge, she thought about the Widow Maker's Memorial in Arlington and the inscription that had guided her through decades of impossible missions. She refused to quit. At 71, Elena Vasquez was still refusing to quit. There were still storms to face, still people to save, still limitations to overcome. The girl who had escaped East LA poverty by learning to fly helicopters had become the woman who taught the world that impossible was just another word for not yet accomplished. 30 years later, the documentary crew had been following Elena for 6 months, capturing interviews and behind-the-scenes footage for a film about the Hurricane Omega rescue and its lasting impact on emergency response doctrine. Now, as Elena sat in the restored cockpit of the Widowmaker at the Smithsonian, she was reflecting on 3 decades of changes that had transformed not just military operations, but the entire relationship between risk and responsibility in modern society. Dr. Vasquez, the interviewer asked, when you made the decision to fly into Hurricane Omega 30 years ago, did you have any idea of the long-term consequences? Elena ran her fingers over the familiar controls of the helicopter that had changed everything, feeling the worn surfaces that had once vibrated with mechanical stress and pilot determination. The St. Christopher medal still hung from the instrument panel, now polished and preserved as a historical artifact. I knew that 47 people needed help and that we were the only ones in position to provide it, Elena replied. Everything else, the changes to military doctrine, the development of extreme weather rescue capabilities, the recognition that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things, all of that grew out of a simple decision to try instead of giving up. The interviewer leaned forward with interest. But surely you understood that you were challenging fundamental assumptions about what was safe and achievable in military aviation. Elena smiled, thinking about the young captain who had been so eager to prove herself worthy of better equipment and more challenging assignments. What I understood was that safety isn't just about protecting the people doing the rescuing, it's about successfully rescuing the people who need help. The safest approach for my crew would have been to stay on base during the hurricane. The safest approach for 47 oil rig workers was for someone to risk everything to reach them. She gestured toward the museum displays surrounding the Widowmaker, which included exhibits about the evolution of extreme weather rescue operations, the development of survivor self-organization techniques, and the expansion of emergency response capabilities to include previously impossible scenarios. The real legacy of Hurricane Omega isn't the specific rescue mission we accomplished. It's the recognition that human capability isn't limited by existing regulations and procedures. When people are properly trained, adequately supported, and motivated by genuine necessity, they can achieve things that look impossible from the outside. The interviewer consulted her notes. We've interviewed several of the oil rig survivors over the past year. They consistently describe the experience not just as being rescued, but as being inspired to approach challenges differently in their own lives. Can you speak to that aspect of the story? Elena felt tears forming in her eyes as she thought about the letters, emails, and phone calls she'd received over the years from people whose lives had been touched by the Hurricane Omega story. Maria Santos had lived to see her great-granddaughter become a helicopter pilot. Carlos Mendoza had started a foundation that trained civilians in emergency response techniques. David Chun had become one of the world's leading authorities on trauma medicine in extreme environments. When people see others refusing to accept artificial limitations, it gives them permission to challenge limitations in their own lives. The oil rig workers who organized themselves during the evacuation, who voluntarily gave up rescue seats to help others, they went home and applied that same spirit of mutual aid and collective problem-solving to their families, their communities, their careers. Elena paused, looking around the museum at the families with children who were learning about courage and determination through the story of a broken helicopter and the people who refused to let it quit. The most important lesson from Hurricane Omega wasn't about flying or emergency response. It was about recognizing that extraordinary circumstances reveal extraordinary capabilities that exist in ordinary people. The helicopter was just the tool. The real power came from people choosing to help each other survive when survival seemed impossible. Present day, 40 years later, Elena Vasquez Chin, now 86 years old, sat in her wheelchair on the porch of her home overlooking Galveston Bay, watching her great-niece Isabella practice helicopter maneuvers in a training simulator visible through the windows of the nearby flight school. The young woman was preparing for her final certification flights with the Extreme Weather Rescue Corps, an international organization that had grown from the lessons learned during Hurricane Omega 4 decades earlier. Beside Elena, a tablet displayed real-time updates from emergency response operations around the world. Category 9 typhoon evacuations in the Western Pacific, wildfire rescues using techniques pioneered during Hurricane Omega, earthquake response operations that incorporated civilian self-organization protocols developed after the oil rig rescue. Abuela Elena, Isabella called through the open window, using the honorary title that dozens of young pilots had adopted over the years. I just completed the Hurricane Omega simulation scenario. 47 successful evacuations in Category 5 conditions, 0 casualties. Elena smiled, remembering when that same scenario had been considered impossible by everyone, except a desperate crew flying a broken helicopter in the conditions that should have killed them all. Today, it was a standard training exercise completed by hundreds of pilots annually. A routine demonstration of capabilities that had once seemed miraculous. Her phone buzzed with a video message from Dr. David Chun, now 92 and still teaching emergency medicine to graduate students around the world. His weathered face filled the screen, his eyes still bright with the enthusiasm that had carried him through decades of impossible rescues. Elena, I just wanted to share some news with you. The World Health Organization has officially adopted the Hurricane Omega protocols for mass casualty events in extreme weather conditions. They estimate it will save an additional 10,000 lives annually worldwide. Elena touched the screen, gently, thinking about the young corpsman who had risked everything to help strangers survive a storm that defied every prediction and protocol. The techniques he'd developed during those terrifying hours above an oil rig had become standard medical doctrine, taught in hospitals and emergency rooms from Manila to Minneapolis. As the sun set over Galveston Bay, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that reminded Elena of emergency lights flashing through hurricane winds. She reflected on the impossible distance between that young pilot who had been relegated to flying broken equipment and this moment of peaceful satisfaction with a life well lived. The St. Christopher Medal from the Widowmaker's cockpit sat on The table beside her, no longer spinning an artificial wind, but catching the last rays of sunlight like a beacon of hope. Elena touched it gently, thinking of her grandmother's words about travelers and the horses brave enough to cross dangerous bridges. 40 years later, the bridge had been crossed not just by one helicopter crew, but by thousands of rescue personnel, who had learned that courage was contagious, that capability could be developed beyond existing limitations, and that the most important qualification for attempting the impossible was the willingness to try. Elena's tablet chimed with the final message of the day, this one from Admiral Isabella Santos Maria, Santos's great-granddaughter and the current commander of Global Extreme Weather Operations. The message was brief but carried the weight of institutional recognition that had taken 4 decades to achieve. Dr. Vasquez Chin, the United Nations Security Council has unanimously approved Resolution 2847, establishing the Elena Vasquez Hurricane Omega Doctrine as the international standard for emergency response in extreme weather conditions. Your legacy will save lives for generations to come. Elena closed her eyes and listened to the sound of her great-niece practicing emergency procedures in the simulator, preparing for a career that would inevitably include situations where the only choice was between attempting the impossible and accepting unacceptable losses. The girl who had once been dismissed as unsuitable for flying perfect aircraft had become the woman who taught the world that perfection was less important than persistence, and that the most valuable qualification for overcoming impossible circumstances was the refusal to abandon people who needed help. Somewhere in the distance, Elena could hear the sound of helicopter rotors, probably a training flight from the nearby Coast Guard station, or perhaps an actual rescue mission heading out into the Gulf, where storms still threatened human lives and helicopters still flew into conditions that looked impossible from a safe distance. The sound was comforting, a reminder that the work continued, that new pilots were learning to push beyond established limitations, and that 47 oil rig workers from long ago had inspired a tradition of courage that would outlast any individual mission or aircraft. Elena Vasquez Chin had finally earned the recognition she'd been seeking her entire career. But more importantly, she'd learned that true recognition came not from institutions or awards, but from knowing that people were alive today because someone had once refused to accept impossible as an answer. The widow maker's spirit lived on in every extreme weather rescue, every civilian who learned to assist in their own evacuation, every pilot who discovered that broken equipment could accomplish things that perfect aircraft couldn't handle, and every ordinary person who chose to do extraordinary things when circumstances demanded courage. As darkness fell over Galveston Bay, Elena smiled at the knowledge that somewhere in the world, other storms were gathering, other impossible missions were being planned, and other crews were preparing to prove that the line between impossible and routine was usually drawn by people who had never been tested by real necessity. The hurricane season never really ended. It just moved to different oceans, different continents, different crews of people who understood that the most important thing wasn't the quality of your equipment, it was the quality of your commitment to bringing everyone home safely. Elena closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the sound of helicopters training for tomorrow's impossible missions, secure in the knowledge that the Widowmaker's legacy would continue as long as people needed help and others were willing to risk everything to provide it.